What do you get when you take American soldiers and place them on the world's most sporting continent? Well, a lot of drinking and a lot of fighting for starters. After time, though, you would get an attempt to combine what would become both countries' national pastimes into a single sport everyone could play. This was Austus, a combination of Australian rules football and American football that would create quite a buzz for a hot minute during World War II. Honestly, combination is a bit of an overstatement. This was basically Australian rules football with a few little tweaks catering to American football players mixed in. In reality, the creation of Austus was less about creating a new sport than it was trying to settle a pointless argument. Is it better to throw or kick a ball? By the way, a quarter of Australian history is just people taking a trivial argument entirely too far. On the other hand, roughly 25% of all American history are people doing something pointless to prove a point that no one actually cares about. This would ultimately serve as the backdrop for the weird attempt to combine Aussie rules and American football. The rise of Austus comes at a really interesting point in history for American and Australian football. In 1933, the NFL legalizes the forward pass without any sort of weird restriction like you have to be 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. Otherwise known as the Nagurski rule, it proved to be a game changer for the sport at the professional level. Meanwhile, Aussie rules football was having passing issues of its own during the mid-1930s. The Victorian Football Association would legalize throw passing at this time. That was in addition to the traditional hand pass. I do not have an Aussie rules football on me, so this American football will have to do, but basically a hand pass is where you take the ball and thump it with your fist like so. That was my third take of doing that, and every time I've hit something in my office. The addition of the pass caused much consternation, especially amongst the VFL folks who really enjoyed kicking and high marking. That is just jumping and catching a kick for the uninitiated. Oh yeah, I guess I should mention there are two separate Aussie rules competitions in Victoria. There's the VFA and the VFL. The VFA has throw passing, the VFL does not adopt throw passing. It's just a mess, it's complicated, and we are just better off not getting into it. However, the throw pass being legal, at least at some levels of the game in Victoria, would be huge when American soldiers showed up to Australia, and in particular Melbourne, during World War II. It was a huge military city throughout the war with the US Army, the Royal Australian Air Force, and other branches of the Australian military around town. Things were taken to another level in 1943 when the US Marines set up a base at Melbourne Cricket Ground, something that really should be taught in US history classes. Suffice to say, not just the cricket ground, but Melbourne as a whole was a hub of Aussie and Yank servicemen. Before I go any further, I need to say this. So much of the history surrounding Austus has been comically embellished by both sides. Things like when Americans saw Australian football for the first time, they realized how much better it was than the American version of the sport, or that the Australians were stunned by how far Americans could throw footballs. It's mostly a bunch of crap. There's probably a little kernel of truth into that, but really, it's just nonsense. It's just make-believe that both sides kind of wanted to use for some sort of weird sporting propaganda. Here's basically what went down without those rose-tinted historical revisions. The Aussies in Melbourne saw a few of the American football exhibitions hosted by the Americans and complained about a lack of action. In particular, they complained about a lack of kicking and high marking. Meanwhile, the Americans saw Australian rules football and said, all of that's fine and well, but wouldn't it make more sense if you threw the ball overhand instead of kicking it all the time? The kick versus throw debate carried on and on. Well, that was when both sets of soldiers weren't getting hammered and beating the stuffing out of one another. Military leadership from both sides of the equation were desperate to find something soldiers could do that was at least slightly constructive here. Anyway, Austus would be born out of the old kick versus throw debate. Marine Private William Jost, otherwise known as Bill Jost, was adamant he could throw a football further than anyone else, pretty much channeling his inner Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite.
How much you want to make a bet I can throw a football over the mountains?
The Aussies were like, that's crazy, mate, what are you talking about? And an informal punt, pass, and kick competition was set up, a competition that Jost did win. This created a buzz, and Jost eventually befriended sports writer and former Aussie rules player for Carlton, Ern Cowley. He told the Journo that if the Aussies would incorporate some American elements into their brand of footy, well, they had themselves a match. Well, not entirely. You see, apparently, ahead of that first Austus clash between the Americans and the Australians, Cowley never bothered to come up with the rules. As the Aussie soldiers and Yanks gathered to play, no one on either side had any idea of what was going on apart from some sort of contest was taking place with some sort of football. In fact, several accounts have noted that the sides were negotiating on the rules up until minutes before the game was supposed to start. An agreement was hammered out, a conclusion was reached. Overhand passing was to be permitted. The Americans could also overhand pass when going for goal. It was also settled that an American football would be used in this matchup. Everything else was to be played under Australian rules. Honestly, this solution is kind of ingenious when you think about it. The Australians could play the game they already knew. For the Americans, the inclusion of overhand passing made it possible for them to do things they already knew when playing American football, and also having the American football being used was somewhat familiar. The rest of Aussie rules football, well, they could just figure it out on the fly. It was as close as you could possibly get to a level playing field given the circumstances. The very first game of Austus would be played at Richmond Football Ground on July 18th, 1943, when a team of Yanks, led by Jost, took on a side from the Australian Department of Munitions, nicknamed the Explosive. Alright, that's pretty clever. Team USA, though, won the very first game by a score of, well, there's some debate around the final score. It was either 53-38 or 69-38. Look, you'll find both totals being reported, and quite frankly, I don't know which one is correct here. Suffice to say, though, the Australians were none too pleased to have lost this game of combined Aussie and American football. Game 2 would feature the same American side going up against what some at the time claimed to be one of the best Australian football teams ever put together, at least up until that point in history. The showdown at Carlton on All Allied Day was billed as this big spectacle, this big to-do, but man, it was a complete bloodbath. The Aussie Ringers were up 60-0 at the end of the first quarter and took a 92-6 lead into halftime. Rough. The second half was more or less a joke. The Aussies took their foot off the gas pedal. They kind of let the Americans get back into the game. Everyone was having a laugh, and eventually the final score would be 115-78. Not truly indicative, though, of the gulf in quality between the two teams on this day. To put the scenario into context, this would be like a bunch of Australian servicemen showing up to America, teaching them how to play baseball, slightly tweaking a few rules so it was more like cricket, say allowing the ball to bounce off the ground and still be considered a strike, then having them play a game against some random military team before taking on the National League All-Stars. Game 3 saw the Americans take on another side composed of Australian servicemen, which was duly won by the red, white, and blue. The fourth clash was played at Geelong and featured some of the Cats' best players of the era, including Lindsay White. Unsurprisingly, the US was not ever in this contest. However, the wildest claim to come from the entire series of games would happen during the fourth clash. It was then during a halftime exhibition that Jost allegedly threw a goal from 76 yards out, which would have been a world record for someone throwing a football overhand. Yeah, about this claim. Prior to enlisting with the Marines, Jost had been playing rec league football, American football that is, on Long Island and had spent some time in the minor league baseball setup. Let's be honest though, if he was really capable of such a feat, if he was capable of throwing a football 76 yards in the air, he would have been playing a little higher up on the football food chain, you'd think. And just to further that point, Jost returned to minor league baseball upon the conclusion of the war, reaching as high as the Class C level. You're telling me there was no NFL interest in a guy throwing the ball 70 yards, no semi-professional interest in a guy throwing the ball allegedly that far? I just don't believe it. I don't think he ever came close to throwing a football 76 yards in the air. It was far for sure, but it was not no world record. What I believe to be the case here is that the Australians saw Jost throwing a football, and it was most likely further than anyone they had seen overhand throw a football up until this point in time because they weren't doing it down under. I suppose it was sort of like when those Aussie punters started showing up in college football and everyone stateside marveled at their skills. Impressive for us here stateside, undoubtedly, but in Australia, they were just guys not good enough to make AFL rosters. That aside, the fifth and final organized game of Austus would be a return engagement with the Explosives, which saw the US win again and end with a record of 3-2. That was sort of it for organized Austus games. The sport would go on to be played informally on military bases across the Pacific Theater. In 1944, Jost and Cowley were awarded medals by the Helms Foundation for creating the hybrid sport, and then everyone just puts a pin in discussions. We'll come back to this and maybe we'll see what happens after the war. 1945 comes along and there's some curiosity here in America about Austus. People had read about it in the papers during the war, and there were some attempts to get things started here to bring the sport as an exhibition to America. Those in Australia announced plans to publish an official rule book and send it to America with hopes of getting folks even more interested. The end goal is to have a touring team sent over from Australia where they would play a few exhibition games against Jost and like whatever team he could organize at the time. It was never really clear who the Australian, the Aussie rule Austus team would play. Support from the Down Under side came from Frank Bow Repair, an Olympic medalist, Lord Mayor of Melbourne, and the namesake of the Bow Repairs tire retailer. He was also the man who organized the first Australian rules football match ever played in London. Throughout 45 and 46, the Aussies are pushing to send two Victorian teams to America to play both Aussie rules exhibitions between each other and Austus games between whoever in America was willing to play the sport, I suppose. Unfortunately, they never found an interested party there. The NFL gets involved and they are just giving the Australian rules backers the absolute runaround. They said they didn't know if gate money and sponsors would be able to offset the travel costs and recommended a West Coast only trip. Of course, only the Rams are on the West Coast at this time, so who were they going to play? Or were they just going to play a bunch of games against whoever the Rams could cobble together? Sadly, the NFL just brushes it off. It would have been really intriguing had those in the Australian rules football world, or the Victorian rules football world at the time, had managed to link up with the fledgling All-America Football Conference, which wouldn't start until after the war. The problem was that none of the American military veterans who had been a part of the Austus movement had any connections to the AAFC. It's also unclear if those running the VFL and VFA knew that the NFL wasn't the only game in town by the late 1940s. Regardless, Austus would sort of fade away from the public eye, and the final nail in the coffin came in 1949. Upon the conclusion of the 1949 VFA Grand Final, the throw pass would be eradicated from Australian rules football for good. So why didn't Austus take off after the war? Because both sides had planned to make this a thing upon its conclusion. Well, like people who have gone overseas and picked up new and exciting things already know, the folks back home didn't get it and they didn't seem to care all that much about it. The Australians really wanted to keep Austus going. The problem was that no one stateside seemed all that keen. Mostly because they hadn't seen the games in person. They weren't there in Australia as Austus was being played. And it's really hard to get something that you weren't there for. And since there weren't really any high-profile athletes who have taken part in Austus, no American had the stage to champion the sport's cause. Realistically speaking, I don't think Austus would have taken off. I don't think it would have been this huge worldwide sensation. I don't think it would be played in America, Australia, or anywhere in the world today. I believe it would have served as an international exhibition where teams of all-stars traveled from one country to the other for a few games, allowing the leagues to bring in huge gates. A critical component of funding both the VFL and NFL and the AAFC, I suppose, during this time period. Seriously, it would have been a massive novelty in the late 1940s and 50s having the best athletes in two respective leagues separated by a huge ocean play a hybrid sport. Alas, it wasn't meant to be. Oh yeah though, for the age-old debate, which one is better, kicking or throwing? It turns out both sides would admit to what we already know. Kicks go longer, but throws are more accurate. Imagine inventing a new sport to find a conclusion that anyone with even the smallest knowledge of sports in the human body probably already knows. Thank you for watching this video. To learn about the story of the NFL's very first indoor football game, that would be the video in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. And for more football content, check out the playlist in the lower left-hand corner. Until next time, I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.